The word philosophy usually stirs up images of wrinkly, enlightened men hunched over a podium, vomiting passages of Kant and insisting on reading these great works in their mother tongue in order to truly understand what Hegel meant. Although this common image of academic philosophy is scary in its own way, sometimes we really just crave a good scare, a brief moment of undeniably, bone-chillingly, scream-inducing, horrifyingly spooky ecstasy. Thankfully, the history of philosophy is stocked with some of the most depressing, dark, and miserable bunch of intellectuals this side of the Café de Flore. Here are the 5 spookiest philosophies. Arguably the mother of all spooky philosophies, nihilism rejects any sort of purpose or value whatsoever. Various forms have existed, although the most cited is arguably existential nihilism, which proposes that life has no inherent meaning. We are born and are never told exactly why, and then we die. This is explored by Sartre's argument that existence precedes essence. Unlike a table that has a creator who has created the table intentionally to be a table, which would be its essence, we are made, usually with far less intent and forethought, and thus exist, and then we have to figure out why. This is of course no revelation. Going all the way back to Shakespeare, we humans have time and time again confronted the void of nothingness, and this confrontation usually coincides with a passionate argument to nonetheless exist. Sartre and Nietzsche somewhat argue for making our own meaning or becoming our true selves. Camus is critical of even this solution and argues for an embrace of the meaninglessness, and by doing so, rebelling against it and asserting one's existence. However, even these acts may risk placing some value on something. Then we're left with an even creepier form that proposes no hopeful solutions and leaves us with feelings of despair, decay, and dread. Some have argued that this is the product of complete intellectual openness. As David Crosby writes, once set in motion, the process of questioning could come to but one end, the erosion of conviction and certitude, and collapse into despair. This rejection of any sort of truths could simply lead to hierarchies of power, where the loudest and most arrogant of views also become the most highly valued. However, Nietzsche does provide us with a comfortable DIY solution to this problem. Just destroy absolutely all interpretations of the world, and then maybe we could find the correct one. Was nihilism too much sad and depressing concerns over your own significance and not enough giant ancient squid gods? Then Cosmicism, or cosmic indifference, is the philosophy for you. Developed by H.P. Lovecraft, the famous American writer of various weird fiction and horror books throughout the 1920s, Cosmicism follows many of the same elements of nihilism, but with a serious emphasis on the indifference of the universe to humans and their activities. In this way, it doesn't outright reject the notion of a higher purpose. Instead, it is our lack of power in changing anything in the grand scheme of things that the universe is so ridiculously large and is so entirely indifferent to anything we do. Hence, it outright rejects humanism. All of the noble achievements, historical acts, and moments of virtue achieved by our species is utterly meaningless. In other words, we could develop a utopian society and then have it all taken away by an asteroid. In fact, in Lovecraft's novels, asteroids are replaced by giant monstrous extraterrestrials who are neither good nor bad but are incredibly dangerous to humanity. The existence and actions of these beings, called the Great Old Ones, is completely outside of the comprehension of humanity and reduces any notion of universal values or morals. Like the universe, these gods don't care about us, are outside of our comprehension, and if we happen to be at the wrong place in the wrong time, will coldly annihilate our entire species. Maybe you're as indifferent to the world as it is about you, but what if this world doesn't even exist? What if you're just a brain in a vat, hooked up to a bunch of electrodes that give you the neurological experience of the world? Here we have solipsism, the idea that your mind, whatever that is the only thing that we can really know exists. This stems from Descartes' hyperbolic doubt, a technique he used when trying to figure out if he exists. He realized that while he was dreaming, he would think his dream was reality. How could he know if he was really awake? He argues that the thing doubting whether he is awake or not is the only thing he can prove to be real. In other words, his doubt or his thinking is the only thing that can solidify any sort of reality for him. This sort of thinking can manifest in certain psychological disorders, such as the Truman Show delusion. The Truman Show is a 1998 comedy drama starring Jim Carrey, in which the main character discovers that his entire life, including his friendships and romantic life, have been constructed by a film crew, and that his existence is mere entertainment for audiences across the world. This concept has also appeared in an episode of The Twilight Zone and some short stories. The disorder itself, heavily researched by McGill philosophy professor Ian Gold and his brother, the NYU psychiatry professor Joel Gold, is characterized by the belief that the entire world is constructed around them and that everyone they see is a paid actor. One spooky component to solipsism and closely linked with the Truman delusion is the notion of philosophical zombies, the idea that we can't know for certain if the people around us have a real consciousness. Instead, they simply display all of the external traits of a conscious organism. If we poked a philosophical zombie, it would display the outward expression of pain, but it would feel nothing on the inside. If we can't be sure if the people close to us are actually conscious beings with the capacity for love and compassion, if we can't assign worth to our lives, if we can't even comprehend just how insignificant we are on the face of the universe, we might start getting less spooked by skeletons and vampires and more scared over our very existence. This argument is proposed by anti-natalism, the school of thought that assigns a negative value to birth. For example, Zepffe argues that consciousness has become over-evolved in humans to the point where it's more of a curse than a blessing. Now we can see, in high definition, our insignificance and can come up with depressing theories like nihilism and solipsism. Plus, we can even imagine the suffering of millions and our own mortality at any moment. Despite our cravings for purpose and the triumph of good over bad, we exist in a world that denies us both at every turn. Zepffe argues that our own extinction is perhaps the only good thing we can really do for ourselves. With increasing concerns over the welfare of animals and ecological collapse, this advocacy for the self-annihilation of humanity has even manifested in movements such as the voluntary human extinction movement. However, on a more psychological level, anti-natalism also finds support. David Beneder argues that there are three general phenomena that allow us to deny just how bad our lives truly are. Our tendency towards optimism that constantly reorganizes our past, present, and future into a prettier picture. Adaptation, which allows us to adapt to negative situations in comparison, namely that we are likely to compare ourselves to others rather than how our lives are going generally. These mechanisms largely discourage pessimism and natural selection, and hence we have developed into a strange, life-loving but suicidal bunch of bipedal chimps. And here we have arrived at the number one most terrifying school of thought, terror management theory. Terror management theory is placed this high largely due to its empirical validity. It argues, like Zepffe, that humans are too smart for their own good, and results in the constant reminder of our eventual death. However, we also have a biological reflex towards self-preservation, and to avoid constant rumination over our own mortality, we need to develop structures in our lives that distract us. These structures are categorized under symbolic immortality or literal immortality. Symbolic immortality, such as national identity, human superiority, and concern over future generations, gives us the sense that our lives are part of something greater and makes us feel like we are more than a biological product of chance. Literal immortality deals explicitly with our death and takes shape in religion mostly, where promises of an afterlife outright deny the possibility that we are truly done when we're done. It should be noted that both of these structures deal with cultural value, and how we live up to these values is incredibly important for our life satisfaction. For TMT, self-esteem is our subjective measure of how we are living up to these cultural standards. For example, if you live in a consumerist and materialist environment and drive a fancy car, keep up your good looks with a morning routine comprised of words like exfoliate and intermittent fasting, and follow the intricacies of business card design, you will likely have a high defense and high self-esteem against death anxiety. TMT is developed from the work of Ernest Becker, an anthropologist who argued in The Denial of Death that human civilization is nothing more than a complex buffer against any awareness of our mortality. We do things simply to avoid thinking about death, including watching YouTube. Becker significantly also argues that our buffers against death eventually conflict against one another, such as when religions encounter each other. Only one could be true about life itself, and hence we see the development of a potentially hostile disagreement. The mortality salience hypothesis in TMT states that if these structures really exist, then disturbing them should create strong reactions by the individual to attempt to restore their sense of invulnerability. This has been tested in countless experimental designs in which individuals are asked to write about their own deaths and then their defenses are measured. For example, in one study, Christian participants were in two groups, one reminded about their own deaths and one that wasn't. They then were asked to evaluate Christian and Jewish participants that were quite similar demographically. Those that were reminded of their own deaths rated their fellow Christians far more positively than the Jewish students, relative to the control group. Hopefully you have been thoroughly spooked by this selection of philosophical concepts. If you haven't, I would like to leave you with the fact that the 200-year-old British utilitarian philosopher Jeremy Bentham's head has been preserved and displayed at the University College London at his request, that there are potentially nude images of Nietzsche circulating the internet, and that the existentialist Arthur Schopenhauer was a real person and actually existed.